The course, the course includes an extensive unit on climate change and requires all students to read the STEM Review on Economics of Climate Change, which was published last year. The course dives into the science behind the issue, the challenge it posed to business and government, as well as discussion on possible solutions. The course includes an extensive unit on climate change and requires all students to read the STEM Review on the Economics of Climate Change, which was published last year. The course delved into the science behind the issue, the challenges it posed to business and government, as well as discussion on possible solutions. In the fast-changing world of modern healthcare, the job of a doctor is more and more like the job of a chief executive. The people who run hospitals and physicians' practices don't just need to know medicine. They must also be able to balance budgets, motivate a large and diverse staff, and make difficult marketing and legal decisions. In the fast-changing world of modern healthcare, the job of a doctor is more and more like the job of a chief executive. The people who run hospitals and physicians' practices don't just need to know medicine. They must also be able to balance budgets, motivate a large and diverse staff, and make difficult marketing and legal decisions. Environmental problems caused by hardcore mining involve water pollution by metals themselves, chemicals used in acid drainage, and sediment. Metals and metal-like elements in the ore are toxic and prone to cause trouble by ending up in nearby streams and water tables as a result of mining operation. Environmental problems caused by hardcore mining involve water pollution by metals themselves, chemicals used in processing, acid drainage, and sediment. Metals and metal-like elements in the ore are toxic and prone to cause trouble by ending up in nearby streams and water tables as a result of mining operations. In recent years, there has been one or two significant happenings that have kept alive the hope that the deep sea may conceal strange links with the past. In December 1939, off the southeast tip of Africa, amazing fish we caught alive, a fish that was supposed to have been dead for long. In recent years, there have been one or two significant happenings that have kept alive the hope that the deep sea may conceal strange links with the past. In December 1938, off the southeast tip of Africa, amazing fish was caught alive, a fish that was supposed to have been dead at least 16 million years. In multilingual country, code mixing, the use of more than one variety in the same utterance or sentence, and code switching, the use of different languages or varieties between sentences is common in nature. Despite its frequency, or perhaps because of it, some scholars and self-appointed guardians of linguistic morality view both code mixing and code switching as a sign of linguistic deficiency. In multilingual countries, code mixing, the use of more than one variety in the same utterance or sentence, and code switching, the use of different languages or varieties between sentences, is common and natural. Despite its frequency, or perhaps because of it, Some scholars and self-appointed guardians of linguistic morality view both code mixing and code switching as a sign of linguistic deficiency. In this landmark account, first published over 20 years ago, the author argues that the ignorance and lethargy of the poor are the direct result of the whole situation of economic, social, and political domination. By being kept in a situation in which critical awareness and response are practically impossible, the disadvantaged are kept submerged. In this landmark account, first published over 20 years ago, the author argues that the ignorance and lethargy of the poor are the direct result of the whole situation of economic, social, and political domination. By being kept in a situation in which critical awareness and response are practically impossible, the disadvantaged are kept submerged.
Students must observe lab safety regulations at all times.
Students must observe the lab safety regulation at all times.
It's the words of common occurrence that have different referential value.
It's the words of the something concurrence which have the something motor values.
The office said Dr. Smith will arrive later today.
The office said that Dr. Smith will come later today.
Student Services provides help with housing and transport.
Student officers provide helping with transport and housing.
A study skills seminar is on for students who require assistance.
The study seminar requires students for the housing seminar.
Any textual references you make should be cited appropriately in the footnotes.
Something which need to be cited correctly in your footnotes.
The research paper should begin with a thorough review of the literature.
A research paper should start with a thorough review of the literature.
The aesthetic implications of this study have not yet been fully explored.
The something research of this paper are not thoroughly referred.
The inherent tension between these two features remains to be addressed.
The inherent tension between these two features remains to be explored.
Journalism is the collection and publication or transmission of news.
Journalism is the transportation, collection, and transmission of the news. This graph gives us information about the largest city worldwide. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at 1950, the largest number can be found in New York, Tokyo, London. This graph gives us information about the largest city worldwide. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at 1950, the largest number can be found in New York and the smallest number can be found in London. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at 2000, the largest number can be found in Tokyo, which is 23, and the smallest one can be found in Seoul. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at 2015, the largest number can be found in Tokyo and the smallest one in Delphi. In conclusion, when we look at them at all, we can see Tokyo is very impressive. Daily calorie consumption from 1975 to 1995. This graph gives us information about daily calorie consumption from 1975 to 1995. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at North America, Europe, and Central Asia, we can see an increase during the whole period. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at world, we can see an increase during the whole period. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that when we look at Africa, we can see an increase during the whole period. In conclusion, when we look at 1995, we can see North America is larger than Europe and Central Asia, and larger than the world, and larger than Africa. This graph gives us information about injury location. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that home, leisure support, 41.4. This graph gives us information about injury location. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the largest number can be found in home, which is 41.4%. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the second largest number can be found in roads, which is 19.5%. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the smallest number can be found in others, which is 2%. In conclusion, we can see that leisure and sport is larger than work, and work is larger than school. This graph gives us information about population growth and the projected population of Sydney from 1976 to 2031. According to This graph gives us information about population growth and projected population of Sydney from 1976 to 2031. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the smallest number can be found in 1976, which is about 3,050,000. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that there is an increasing trend, and the next number is 4,128,170. The largest number can be found in 2031, which is 5,300,000. In conclusion, it's increasing. This graph gives us information about the height of different buildings. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the largest number can be found in Taipei 101. It's 1,670. The second one is 1,483, 1,455. This graph gives us information about heights of different buildings. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the largest number can be found in Taipei 101, which is 1,670 feet. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the second largest number can be found in Patron Tower 1 and 2, Kuala Lumpur, which is around 1,483 feet. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that the smallest number can be found in CR Tower, Chicago, 1,450 feet. In conclusion, we can see the height is very similar. This graph gives us information about manufacturing output in the UK. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that in the first period from 1992 to 2003, we can see a decrease. According to the graph, this graph gives us information about manufacturing output in the UK. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that in the first period from 1999 to 2002, you can see a decrease. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that in the second period from 2002 to 2005, you can see an increase. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that in the third period from 2006 to 2007, you can see an increase. In conclusion, in general, you can see an increase trending.
Milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. First, it is very grand, which most, especially later foundations, aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in the 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly, it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded, 900, 1,000, even in one case 1,200 years ago.
This lecture is basically about Mel's monastery, Austria. According to the graph, the lecture firstly mentioned is not very typical. Firstly, in the first part of the lecture, the speaker mentioned it's very grounded, which is not very real. According to the graph, it is quite clear to see that in the second period, the speaker mentioned it's all about the countryside. In the third part of the lecture, the speaker mentioned it's a very large and grounded land. In conclusion, we can see this lecture is basically about Austria and Mel monastery, which is very interesting.
Corruption comes at a huge economic and social cost, and that cost is felt most acutely by the world's poor. Dr. Arnold has already given the staggering figure of $1 trillion US that's paid in bribes worldwide. It is an extraordinary figure. It's a figure that equals 10 times what is paid each year by donors in international development assistance. 10 times development assistance. And even this huge amount, $1 trillion, could be an underestimate because it's very difficult to capture a number of the more elusive transactions within the public sector that involve corrupt dealings, such as budget leakages and asset theft. Corruption sharpens income inequality, and it impacts disproportionately on the poor. In many countries, corruption works as a regressive tax on household incomes. Regressive because it impacts much more on the poor than the more wealthy. Compared with higher income groups, lower income families pay a much larger share of their incomes in bribes to access basic public services, and their overall access to those services is reduced.
This lecture is basically about corruption and development aid. According to the lecture, in the first part, they mentioned $1 trillion US dollars are paid for corruption payments. After that, the speaker also mentioned it 10 times each year for the donation. After that, in the next part of the lecture, she also mentioned the corruption impacts the poor most much larger than the wealthy family. After that, he also mentioned the pay tax for basic infrastructure service for development is very required. In conclusion, this lecture is interesting.
This is Hans Krebs, who in 1937 published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions, by which energy is released in individual cells. It's called the Krebs cycle, which some of you may remember from your chemistry course in high school. Krebs is a wonderful example to me of how a scientist who is determined can overcome all kinds of human obstacles. Krebs' father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence and would never do anything important in his life as a teenager. What Krebs remembers in his memoir, his father said to him, "You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." And later on, when Krebs studied with the great biochemist Otto Warburg, Warburg also told him the same thing, not the same quote, but that he had only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. And we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children. But sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.
This lecture is basically about Hans Krebs at the peak of his career. In the first part of the lecture, he mentioned in 1937 he studied the sequence of energy release. After that, in the second part of the lecture, Hans Krebs discouraged by his father because he felt like he's the average person. And after that, he also mentioned he always said he's a meteorology person, very ordinary. But he also mentioned the children can go on to do great things no matter what they are told. In conclusion, this lecture is very encouraging.
To which of our senses do all of the following words relate? Opaque, vivid, brilliant, shiny.
Eyesight.
In a recession, does economic activity increase, slow down, or stay the same?
Slow down. Slow down.
In medical terms, are antibodies harmful or beneficial for patients?
Beneficial. Unharmful.
Would a person suffering problems with their vision consult a biologist or an optometrist?
Optometrist. Optometrist.
Would fresh milk last longer in a fridge or in a cool cupboard?
In a fridge.
Historians use evidence to draw conclusions about the past. Would a contemporary artist's painting of an ancient battle be an original source or a secondary source?
Secondary source. Secondary source.
What is the subject of study at a culinary institute?
Some study culinary institute. Architect.
Where would you expect to find equipment like microscopes, Bunsen burners, beakers, and petri dishes?
Lab. Laboratory.
What is the name of the field of study that studies the human mind and behavior?
Neuroscience. Sociology.
A planet or galaxy that is very distant can be seen with what device?
Telescope.